And so we begin our class considerations for another week. And each week presents a particularized cycle within itself. Each day a cycle by itself, but a cycle of a week. So we have wheels within a wheel there, and then the week cycles within the cycles that are natural to our entire class term. As you begin to function on the basis of the principles of reality, you learn to discern the factors which should come to focus in a cycle that is of comparatively short duration, and you do not try to bring to focus in the present those factors which are of a larger cycle. You let them work out. One of the causes for difficulty, futility, and failure is this: until the human being learns to so function in the current of the Spirit that he can discern what factors are properly to be brought to focus today and what factors are to be left alone to work out in a larger cycle, he will be tending to ignore the things that should come to focus today, and he'll be trying to bring to focus today things that should be left alone. Now, the human mind with human intelligence cannot learn to do this in self-activity. Simply cannot be done. There are no rules and regulations you can point to. In the ordinary sense, you can't put it on what is commonly called a scientific basis. That is, subject to the logic and reason of the intellect. But once you begin to let the Spirit control, you find it is on a scientific basis. And that logic and reason recognize the reality as it manifests. So, one of the things that you can do very effectively in relationship to your own progress is to watch, not trying to make something be thus and so, but just to watch and observe, be alert. Watch the cycles working out in relationship to yourselves, to whatever degree you can see them in relationship to one another, but particularly watch the cycles as they work out in the material which I present to you. Because there, if you are alert, you can perceive the variations. One of the points I might use to illustrate this is the present manifestation of moisture, which we have so beautifully made manifest. The winter has been, comparatively speaking, dry, and there was a vibratory pattern working out. I won't attempt to describe all the factors of it, which it would have been futile to try to change it in the ordinary sense. But we had in our own land the principle of mulch on the surface and so on, so that we had a remarkable amount of moisture in the soil regardless of the dry season. And those of you who may have heard me say anything about it, when someone would mention the dry weather or the need for moisture or something like that, you would hear me say, I do not believe that it has hurt our soil yet. There's a recognition that so far our crops, our land, was not hurt or in real danger. As the pattern worked out, the Vibratory factors began to change. There was a refocalization in various ways, which I won't attempt to describe at the moment. And some of you, at least, were in position to hear me say something about it about 3 days before this moisture arrived. Now, if I had been struggling or working, trying to set up a cycle that would result in rain or the coming of moisture, prior to that, it would have been out of order. But when the pattern worked out to a point where the vibratory factors could properly be brought to focus, we began to do something about it, and the moisture came. When I say we, I'm not talking about it just from a standpoint of human minds or human strength or human determination. I'm talking about it from the standpoint of the working of God's laws. Now, there could have been a great deal of speculation and so-called prayer or trying to get in relationship to the moisture pattern, but you didn't see any of that, at least not with any authorization from me. But when the cycle worked out, the vibratory patterns were brought to focus, there were various indications and expressions on the, well, away from our little valley, shall I say, that would indicate that it couldn't be now. That there were those who had lost faith or hope that there would be any moisture at an early date. And they weren't doing anything to help the thing from the standpoint of cooperation, but there was some opposition. Well, you can always use opposition too, you know. It's only the lethargic, the lukewarm, that you can't use. The lukewarm patterns or currents are just no good. But from the standpoint of reality, we can use them when they're either hot or cold. If they're cold, that is, in the opposition pattern, it won't be to any credit or blessing of those who are so functioning, but we can use opposition factors as well as response factors in the ordinary sense. Because you come to recognize that opposition factors are, in fact, response factors. Not the right pattern of response, and we would avoid that as much as we can. But where opposition develops, that can be used just as surely as direct, definite response factors. Only when there is a lethargic spirit, only when there is a lukewarmness, an inertia, something that doesn't feel one way or the other, that is useless. It cannot be calculated in relationship to any specific outworking. But in any case, the vibratory factors came to focus, and we have the wonderful supply of moisture which the Lord has sent to us, and for which we are very, very thankful. We could use many other illustrations, but learn to watch the vibratory factors. Learn to perceive them. If you do not practice looking for them and watching them, you will never learn to see them. It takes alertness, observation, and it takes the process of letting. For here we see letting comes into two specific classifications. One, letting the vibratory factors of the larger cycle alone, letting them work on out. But the factors which are supposed to come to focus in the present, letting them have the proper vibratory pattern, the control and design patterns, so that they can manifest. You go through a process of letting in both cases. One, you let it work out further. Let the cycle continue. Leave it alone. Do not try to make it be thus and so. The others, you let them come to point in the present. You cooperate. You give them an opportunity of having control focalization. And this gives you an opportunity to have a little insight into the way in which human beings fail to receive God's blessings. Because for some reason or other, whether they're struggling or being concerned about the larger cycle, or whether they're self-centered or functioning wrongly in some fashion, they will fail to cooperate into receiving into focalized pattern in relationship to themselves the vibratory factors that should come to focus. Now, they're not going to just by some magic means gather to a point and manifest for you. There has to be some way of receiving them. You have to give them a contact point. Now, if you're trying to get hold of vibratory factors that are beyond your reach, that you have no business playing with, you're going to be in trouble, or at least fail. But there are those factors each day in your life, right here, now, which are supposed to begin to come into focus. And unless you are so functioning that you can gather them in and let them have point in relationship to yourself, they're not going to come into form. They'll pass on by. The thing is so scattered that it never appears. If there hadn't been a reasonably good, it wasn't perfect by any means, but if there hadn't been a reasonably good control pattern working with respect to the unit here, this moisture that we are having wouldn't have appeared. It might have landed somewhere else, but it wouldn't have appeared here, because, well, there were factors which tended to get in the way a little bit as it was, but it worked. And the focus permitted it to manifest here, where it was needed. Now, it was not a matter of trying to make clouds be or trying to make rain be. Just to briefly indicate part of the problem, there's been a heavy fall of moisture on the western slope, some of the heaviest fall of snow that they've had over there for a long time. It's pretty well stayed on all winter, which is unusual. And they've been having unusual rains out here in Kansas. Places were just practically being flooded out. It was landing over there, and it was landing over there, here, but it was either going down before it got this far or skipping clear over, landing way out yonder. So, the pattern, by reason of various factors, some could say possibly the atomic bomb explosions had something to do with it, possibly this, possibly that. In any case, it wasn't coming here, which it needed to do. Well, it was the opportunity then to begin to let the vibratory factors come into play, come to focus, and let it appear here. It was available. It wasn't a matter of trying to make it be in some fashion. It was simply a matter of receiving it. And that is the principle with respect to all of God's blessings, as far as you are concerned. It's a matter of receiving. And unless you let the proper vibratory factors come to focus in yourself, or in relationship to the unit, or whatever pattern you're working in, you will not be doing your part. If you are tending to scatter vibratory factors and resist and disturb, then you're not really helping. If it turns into real opposition, perhaps you will be helping in spite of yourself, but then that is no credit to you. The point is that we have something to do, and we have to learn how to function in relationship to it. Now, at the moment, I can tell by the looks on some of your faces anyway that this sounds a little ambiguous, a little, well, these are the things we're here to learn. Don't imagine that you're supposed to be able to so function overnight, but I wanted you to take a little look at it to see the principles involved so that you could stop rejecting God's blessings which are coming your way and start doing your part toward letting the vibratory factors come to focus as they are supposed to appear in your life. in relationship to the unit here or in relationship to the Lord's service, wherever the pattern may be working out. All of this has a very definite bearing on the basic principles that we have been studying in relationship to history. Because one of the great values in history, as it has been introduced, is to let you see how it was that human beings failed to receive blessings when they could have, when they should have, when they were provided. How human reactions or self-activity dissipated the vibratory factors that were supposed to come to point, instead of letting them come into focalization in relationship to the individuals then living. Unless you begin to see history on this basis, you will not be able to gain the greatest possible comprehension of the lessons that are contained there. Of course, you can always say that history teaches various things, more or less on the surface or to be intellectually observed. One of the things that tends to come into consciousness for anyone who really studies history is the idea that there are great cycles that work out and have within the whole scope of recorded history that can be seen in relationship to the rise and fall of empires. A certain pattern would begin to take form. People would cooperate in it up to a certain point. Then they'd begin to be lethargic and self-righteous and self-satisfied, so on. And you can see where the graph of the cycle begins to level out, and in that pattern you look at the historical factors and you see how these people were so self-content. They thought they were on top of the world and they were just going to stay there. And then, perhaps almost imperceptibly at first, there was a decline, beginning to go down. And then suddenly, generally, a plunge. And another cycle to begin. The rise and fall of empires. The great cycles in history. And we can look at those great cycles. Probably have enough knowledge of history to see clearly the points I'm talking about at the moment. You can look at those and see how human beings precipitated those things. They were the ones that brought it about. We see a dangerous tendency that has been in manifestation for some time in our own country of a leveling off. There's a little rally at the present time. How well it's going to hold, we shall see. But being called the greatest nation on earth, etc., taking some of our blessings and privileges and opportunities for granted, tending to be self-righteous and self-satisfied, feeling secure with industrial patterns and business, commerce. We've got the best of everything, etc., etc. I'm not sure that that's true. Up to a certain extent it is, but not on the basis that's generally thought of. And all of this self-righteousness, and what do we begin to see? Self-satisfied. Instead of the forward movement upward, a tendency to level off. A tendency to lose the moral fiber, the strength, the stamina, the pioneering spirit necessary to keep moving upward. Now it's our business, in part, to help maintain that pioneering spirit in relationship to our national program. It works here in Canada or wherever there's response to it. there must be something moving upward. If we pause to consider the matter just very briefly, we could see that the reason why England, as the center of the British Empire, has managed to stay up as well as it has been because of the outlying dominions, where something of that upward swing was present, and it siphoned back to England. If England had been left more or less on her own, and the pattern had worked out as it did in England, it too would have reached the point of taking the great plunge before this. But the upward trend in the dominions held it up. Now, all the way back through history, we see how God has given man opportunities over and over again which man has failed to utilize. He didn't take advantage of them. He started to, perhaps, in some ways, and then let self-activity enter in. In recorded history, we do not have any specific pattern which makes for easier examination and analysis in this regard than the experience of the children of Israel. And it is this specific pattern which we started out to examine somewhat for this purpose, so that you could see something of the mistakes they made, what the results were, see something of the opportunities that were present, see how they did function correctly under certain conditions, up to a point anyway, and then lost what they had gained. So our purpose is to begin to analyze the history of the children of Israel in order to see what relationship that outworking has to us. And you'll be surprised, if you've not already begun to see it, how closely those same principles, those same factors show up in relationship to ourselves in this present day. We won't be studying history as something way back yonder. We'll see it in relationship to the present cycles, because the same basic factors are present in any case, and it is brought out into the pattern that you see on the basis of symbolism. And we begin to appreciate the meanings of the various symbolic factors. We begin to see how those things are in operation here and now, so that we're not relegating it merely to a story out of the past. As I suggested before, once you see the prehistoric pattern, see how man went through a process of rapid devolution and gradually began to move upward again. We began to have a written record, the early Egyptian period, etc. We begin to see the dawn of history. And back in that period of the dawn of history, our attention comes to focus on a man called Abraham and his particular pattern of response, things that began to work out in his life. I do not suppose that any of you ever think of Abraham without thinking almost in the same split second of Melchizedek. In any case, the very mention of the name Abraham should remind you instantly of Melchizedek. Melchizedek king of Salem, meaning the Prince of Peace. The beginning pattern initiated by Melchizedek, who according to the record was not as a man born. He was without beginning of years as we think of it, without end of days. In other words, the picture we have is of a being who was not subject to birth and death or ascension as we think of it in relationship to this particularized pattern. And we recall that this king, the king of Salem, or Melchizedek, comes into the picture at a time when Abraham had some trouble. His brother Lot is not as responsive to the Spirit of God as Abraham was, and he was inclined to like the creature comforts. He wasn't of the same pioneering spirit. He didn't have the same moral fiber and stamina, and he got into trouble. There was a raiding party, as was common in those days with respect to the various tribes that were beginning to take form. And each little group had its king. So there were all kinds of kings in those days. And the king, or the leader, the chief, you might say, from the standpoint of some later patterns, was the one who governed his particular group and engineered their forays one against another in the offense and defense of the growing pattern of so-called civilization. And one of these kings had come against Lot and carried off some of the people and the animals and the goods. And the king of Salem went out to help, didn't he? He cooperated with Abraham in bringing this king under control. They had a little battle. And the upshot was that the loot or the plunder that had been taken was restored. Now it's in that setting that we see the beginnings of this pattern. It's interesting to note that the same cycle initiated with respect to the Orient has the same type of setting. Two wholly different outworkings on the basis of the historical pattern. And with respect to the biblical record, we can see this one with respect to Abraham and Melchizedek. But in the opening phases of the historical pattern as it relates to the Orient, we have a very similar story. And it opens in relationship to a very similar pattern of battle. If you know anything about the Bhagavad Gita, you will appreciate what I have reference to. If you do not, don't worry about it for the moment. I'm hoping to introduce you to the song Celestial before too long. It was, the version that we use was translated from the Sanskrit by Sir Edwin Arnold. He did a beautiful job, but just as we find is the case with respect to the Bible, so is it there. The centuries through which these records come to us, and the manipulations of priesthoods, etc., have obscured some of the specific meanings, some of the symbolism, some of the values, and some of them become, under this pattern, definitely misleading. So, a number of years ago, just about 10, I suppose now, roughly speaking, I undertook to revise the significant portion of the song Celestial. And it is that revised pattern of Sir Edwin Arnold's translation of the Bhagavad Gita, which he called the Song Celestial, which we will use as opportunity affords. But I wish to draw particularly to your attention now the fact that that story, too, begins on a battlefield. The story begins with Abraham, Melchizedek, and Lot on a battlefield. And when we come to the story of the Bhagavad Gita, we find that there is the blind king, there is Arjuna, who would correspond in principle to Abraham, there is Krishna, who corresponds in principle to Melchizedek. And exactly the same principles, exactly the same laws, exactly the same processes are portrayed in these two patterns, one with a setting as you know it with respect to Abraham, and the other far away in the Orient, where it took form in the revelation of the laws and principles of God in a completely different place and setting, and yet the same kind of setting. Once we begin to note such similarities and to see that these two revelations of divine principle and law started, in each case, though so widely separated, started on a battlefield. Well, now, what is the case with respect to you? When you begin to move into the pattern of the divine design, is there one of you that could say that the story with respect to your life did not begin on a battlefield? Didn't it begin on a battlefield with you? Certainly it did. Wasn't there a blind king, your own self-active mind? Wasn't there a Lot in the lot? Certainly. There's always some kind of a battle. It has various patterns in the background of your individual lives, but there was at least an internal conflict. There was a refusal to accept the realm of limitation round about. There was probably in you the contest between the Abraham side of your nature and the Lot side of your nature. If you look back, the Lot side wanted to be content with things as they are, more or less, and talked about how good it was to get settled down in the right kind of a pattern. And the Abraham side was the pioneer. Just settling down here like that, it's just the same as everyone else is doing. Just having these creature comforts, that isn't going to bring the fulfillment of life. We need to lead on out into something more wonderful. We need to recognize something. We don't know what it is yet, but we have the assurance that there will be a revelation. We will begin to find the way, the truth, and the life. We will begin to know where we're going, why we're here, where we came from, what our purpose is, and how to begin to serve, to have our lives have meaning in any case, whether the word service came into the thought pattern or not, so that we can have meaning, so that we can accomplish that for which we came into the world. And so, there was the Lot side of you, to whatever degree it tended to have an influence, and there was the Abraham side of you. We could examine the same picture as it is revealed in the Bhagavad Gita, but there was the Arjuna side of you. And just as there was a Melchizedek to reveal the way At the time of Abraham, there was a Krishna to reveal the way at the time of Arjuna. Always, whenever human beings have been ready to respond to God and let the will of God be done on earth, and they were ready to yield to the will of God, leave behind the old patterns, always there has been provision by which the things of God might become known to those who would receive them. And we have two outstanding illustrations of this. And if these two patterns had been allowed to work out, the one in the Near East, we would say, as it extended out into the Occident, and the other in the Orient, it would not have been necessary for our Lord to come on earth. If either one of these patterns had held, if either one of them had been allowed to work out the way it should have, it would not have been necessary for the Lord of Lords and King of Kings to come into the world and face the things he did. It was perfectly possible. It was a divine opportunity extended to man with a wonderful invitation. But man didn't let it work out in either case. And so, finally there was the manifestation of the pattern, the same principles all over again, same type of thing all over again, in what we call the New Testament story. For the land was under subjection to the Roman rule. There was the pattern of conflict and unrest. There was the Herod the king. There was Jesus Christ. Exactly the same thing in principle, revelation, laws of being, all over again. A different focalization of them, but exactly the same laws and principles. And outside of the particular facts with respect to the Master as a being, did he bring into the world any truth? Did he reveal to man any knowledge that had not already been offered to man? Many would be inclined to say, yes, he surely did, but is it so? No. It had already been revealed to man. It was already available to man, but man wasn't taking advantage of it. He refocalized it, revitalized it, but outside of the newness of the reality of his own being and manifestation on earth, and the application as it was established with respect to himself, there was nothing new in it, because it had all been given before. And once we begin to see that, realize it, and you will see it as we go along, you begin to see that it was not God's design, it was not arbitrarily required by God that our Lord and King himself should come into the world and face the things he did. It was unnecessary. And so, I wonder, cut just a moment. Perhaps the best way to make this beginning is to actually read some of the story. Let you see how it worked out. We'll begin Well, we don't want to read too much of this, and you surely remember it. I'll attempt to pick out the parts that are necessary. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. The Saran was barren. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. One of the first things we note here is the necessity for the human capacity to accept in relationship to oneself a great promise. The tendency in human beings is to say, well, that can be for someone else, somewhere else, but to receive for oneself a great promise. Looking at it in the ordinary fashion, if Abram had, for instance, talked to others about it, wouldn't they have said, well, look at this egotistical creature? Well, we thought he was a man. We thought he was a good fellow, but now he's gone nuts. He says that he's going to, this sort of thing is going to happen to him. Why, that's just ridiculous. And if Abram had taken the same attitude about it that human beings generally do even today, why, I must have had a bad dream. I must have had something to eat wrong. Something happened. This idea came to me. It seemed vivid enough at the time. The word of the Lord it was supposed to be. But just imagine me. I'm supposed to go somewhere, I don't know where. And I'm to be the father of a great nation. I'm to be the means by which all the children of men shall be blessed. Why, what arrogance for me to even think that such a thing could be me. Now, if God produced a great person over there or something and gave us a leader, I would be happy to follow. But for me, just to think, me? No. But he accepted a great promise in relationship to himself. There was no outer evidence of it, that is, of the fulfillment of the promise. But there was the willingness to do his part. Not arrogance or foolhardiness, but not holding back, not refusing to have a share in God's givingness. Not refusing to let himself be the means by which something could come on earth. You remember that he had another reason. His wife was barren. And yet, the word of the Lord came to him on this basis. He could have said all kinds of things. He didn't always function in absolute perfection, perhaps, but he accepted a great promise in relationship to himself when everything made it look as if he was simply having a pipe dream. was ridiculous, was fanciful. Now, if you learn that one lesson out of this, how important it is. It takes a greatness of character. It takes a greatness inside for a human being to accept a great promise in relationship to himself without becoming egotistical, arrogant, and self-active on the one hand, or without rejecting it in a false pattern of humility on the other hand. There's the central way. Most people reject the blessings of God because they're so humble. Humility is necessary, true humility. But the false pattern of humility has been used by the adversary to defeat many, many people. Oh, it's necessary to be humble before God, yes. But a false pattern of humility has made so many people refuse to accept the great promises in relationship to themselves. And what did Abram start with but a promise? What was there in the pattern round about him, in the uncertainties of the world of that time, the tribal feuds and all the rest of it? What kind of character, what kind of capacity, what kind of a quality would that be? Something quite remarkable, don't you think? That under those circumstances, a man had the capacity to accept a great promise in relationship to himself, when there was no outer evidence to indicate that he was doing anything but having a foolish dream. Looked like everything was against him. But that is the spirit of the true pioneer, and the quality of a man or a woman who will dare to accept a great promise as having meaning to himself or herself. It's easy enough to set it aside. It's easy enough to spoil it with arrogance, egotism, on the one hand, or to reject it in the false pattern of humility. So few there have been in the world who had what it took to walk in the central way, to be balanced. Because if you do walk in that central way, there will be those who will take the attitude that you are arrogant, that you are an egotist. How often I've been classified as an egotist because I refuse to relinquish the position that I have a mission on earth, I have a message to give, I have a purpose, something that's important to the whole of humanity. And how often I've been called egotistical, because in a false pattern of humility I wouldn't deny the commission. And when I received that commission, was there any outer evidence that we'd ever reach a point where I'd have the privilege of standing here talking to you? The extent to which that has reached out into the world already means something. And we share it. But it takes that something that causes an individual to accept a great promise as having meaning in relationship to himself, in actual fact, so that he's ready to act upon it. Not just to say, well, now I'll wait and see if such and such a thing works out, or someday, perhaps, somehow. But to act upon it when from every outer standpoint it appears that you're just plain fanciful, ridiculous. To dare to do in the face of that type of situation. And the Lord told him to get thee out of thy country. Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house. Now, for anyone who is going to amount to anything on earth, that's the finest advice that can be given, whether to Abram or somebody else. It's the advice the Lord gave. And anyone who wants to really serve God on earth had better do it. Because as long as one stays in the pattern of kinfolk as ordinarily established, he'll become subject to the old pattern, the old situation. Of course, sometimes you can take Mother and Dad along. I managed that for Kathy's sake, but it was quite a struggle. But that's what it was. Get thee out of thy country. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to move from the United States to Canada or somewhere, but you have to make a change. You're not going to do it in the old pattern because, well, it'd just be asking too much. You've got to dare to make a move. Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house. Now there is instruction that applies to any man or woman, any boy or girl who finds himself stirred of the Spirit of God out there in the world. And it is our business to help establish a place to which those aspiring souls may come and turn, that they may not just go wandering through the patterns of life, seeking and never finding. But there are many of all ages out there in the world pattern today who are hearing that call. Some of them are beginning to act upon it. Some of them are just getting conditioned to the idea. But they're ready to come and be with us. Not necessarily just geographically, but from the standpoint of sharing in the working of God's plan on earth. And so the word today, just as surely as it was then, the word of the Lord, if you please, is, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. That's a promise to you. You have accepted it, or you wouldn't be here. With some of you it was a little difficult, perhaps, and some of you not so difficult. But if you hadn't been ready and willing to get out of the place where you were, and leave behind the kindred and all the rest of it, and move, no matter how blindly, for a while perhaps, you wouldn't be here. So you have obeyed that instruction of the Lord to some degree anyway. Once you begin to see that, you can see something of your responsibility in relationship to obeying the rest of the instruction and not going off on a tangent, not spoiling it. And he said, and unto a land that I will show thee. We have found it. And I will make of thee a great nation. Well, now that doesn't necessarily have to mean that you will have to be the original parents that produces a great nation after so many generations. No. That's more or less the way it worked out with Abram, but we're not Abram. We're ourselves right here. I will make of thee a great nation. All of those who so respond, who are willing to dare to move out of the old patterns and into the new. Whoever they are, wherever they are, without respect to race or creed or color. I will make of thee a great nation. And that promise applies for us today and the people who are awakening just as surely as it did to Abram. And what does he say? And I will bless thee. Not perhaps, I will. Once we begin to move in that pattern, as you have done or you wouldn't be here, once you begin to share, in a true sense, that divine outworking, I will bless thee. Of course, you have to learn how to receive the blessing. That's one of the things you're learning now. The thing we've been talking about this morning. And it's the thing you have to learn how to help others learn. Because human beings simply do not know how to receive the blessings of the Lord. And that's the difficulty. So when you learn to receive them, and you can inspire others to receive those blessings, you are serving. And those who are responding to that call, which is sounding in the world today as surely as it did at the time of Abram, begin to see the pattern of service to the glory of God and the blessing of the children of men to which you are called. So few, yes, but as we hold it steady, do our part, it will open, and there are many who are ready to become a part of this great nation. Not a great nation in the sense of entering into competition with the United States or Canada or Great Britain or someone else. No. A great nation in the sense of a body of human beings who are willing to serve God on earth, to let the will of God be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Now, when you are blessed, you are supposed to become a blessing. What did the master say? He that would be greatest among you, let him be the servant of all. Or he that would be great among you. The same principle exactly that God had expounded to Abram way back there. The same principle. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. My question is, today, in concluding this class period, are you man enough, are you woman enough, to receive that promise in relationship to yourself in this day, in this time, in this hour? Because it's offered to you just as surely as it was offered to Abram. It may not look like you can do anything about it, but how about accepting a great promise in relationship to yourself in this hour? This promise, that you shall be blessed, and that you may be a blessing to others, that you may let this have meaning in your life now. Because if it was of any value at the time of Abram, as he was then known, it's of value to you in this moment. And it applies to you just as surely as to Abram. If you will let yourself do your part in this moment, in this hour, in relationship to this cycle of the divine plan. Because it's the same promise today as it was then, for the same purpose. It's not a changed pattern. Oh, it may manifest differently, yes, but just the same laws, the same promise, the same principles, the same God, all for the same purpose. And we are the ones who are on earth and have a chance to take a look at it. Are you man enough, woman enough, to receive a great promise from God Himself to you now.